Hi, this is Kira Davis, host of Just Listen to Yourself with Kira Davis. And our podcast is growing so quickly that we've got a great problem. We need a new theme song. So we're asking our listeners and our fans to create a theme song for the show and send it to us. It needs to be at least 30 seconds, but it can be a full-length song because here is the really cool thing. Not only will you have the possibility to win $150, but you also can have the opportunity to have your song released on FCB Records in conjunction with The Orchard at Sony Music. That's right. You'll get a release thanks to Sony Music. Does it get any better than that? If you've got an entry, send it to me right here at JLTY@protonmail.com. JLTY@protonmail.com. Contest closes April 21st.
This is the FCB Radio Network, home of the best personalities and where real talk lives. Online at fcbradio.com. FCB.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Just Listen to Yourself with Kira Davis. I, of course, am your host, Kira Davis. And this is the podcast where we take hot topics, hot button issues, and we discuss the talking points on those issues, and we draw those talking points out to their logical conclusion. This is an exercise in critical thinking, which is desperately needed these days. And today's episode, I think, really fits the definition of critical thinking, criticizing our assumptions, the way that we're thinking, making sure that we're digging into the ideas that we're talking about. I think it's really important to criticize ourselves. I really do. I think it is important to criticize ideas. And by criticize, I don't mean the typical definition of you're the worst or that shirt makes you look fat. Not that kind of criticize, but more in the vein of constructive criticism, right? The idea that when you take the time to examine whatever, your shirt, an idea, your religious beliefs, what you're doing is encouraging yourself to explore and simultaneously shore up your ideas or discard the ones that just aren't working for you, that just kind of don't hit it. And the longer I do this show, the more I find myself talking my own self out of ideas that I post regularly. I was in my work chat room recently and we were having a discussion about, I can't remember what it was, what's appropriate or something, appropriate language on the front page or something like that. I can't remember. But I just remember, like, I put one argument down, like, oh, I don't really have a problem with this. I don't see what the big deal is. And then as I was thinking about it for the next minute or so, I thought, well, but maybe this is the issue. Maybe these people are right. Well, yeah. And then I kind of wrote, well, I've changed my mind on the issue. I literally just talked myself out of my former position. I think that's the result of this show. I think I've been doing that unintentionally a lot more lately. So I guess it's a good thing. Maybe it comes off as wishy-washy or flip-floppy from time to time. So I probably need to practice. I mean, it's always discernment, right? You got to practice where you drop those things. It's always discernment. But this show's been just as much an exercise for me as it is for you guys. I've had some great listener responses over the last few weeks. I'm going to share those with you soon, probably next week. We're continuing our experiment with the JLTY mini-sodes, and I'm so excited for you guys to hear my interview with my father-in-law. If it goes over well, I'm going to travel back to Arizona to do some more with him and maybe even take your questions with me. So I hope you enjoy it. Please write me and let me know what you think of my dad. If it's mean, I'm just going to delete your email, but I can't imagine anyone having anything mean to say about it. You can write me at JLTY@protonmail.com, JLTY@protonmail.com. Let me know what you think of the latest mini-sode with my dad. All right, let's get into today's topic, because it really is about critical thinking, as I was saying at the top of the show. I want us to examine some long-held stereotypes, some long-held beliefs, and I want us to criticize those ideas. I want us to think critically about those ideas. Today, I want to talk about why the Republican Party is so racist. Now, I'm not talking about this from the point of view of I think the Republican Party is just so racist. But this is a question, as a conservative, I get asked a lot. This is a question that we talk about a lot in endless circles in media and on panel shows. And there are definitely some long-held and very well-established stereotypes about Republicans and racism that are perpetuated, of course, by the movies we watch and what we see on TV and how politicians frame their disagreements and arguments, all of that. I've said it on the show before. I'll remind you again, I'm actually a registered Democrat. That's kind of meaningless here in the state of California. That's what you have to be to vote. We're literally a direct democracy here. If you want to see why direct democracy doesn't work, why so many people always push back on that term, we're a democracy. We're not. A democracy is a terrible thing, and you just need to look to California for all the reasons why. But here in California, we basically have one party rule. It's endless. And if you want to participate in any primary activities, anything like that, I mean, the person you're going to elect is going to be a Democrat in this state. So I've chosen not to limit myself on who I can choose to get through that first Democrat primary. You know, if I got to be subjected to these people, at least I should be able to have a choice in who gets the furthest. So I'm not defending the Republican Party in any way today. I'm not speaking as a Republican. I am a conservative. That never changes. Party is almost meaningless to me at this point, although I strongly defend the two-party system and still do. I have no plans to become third party or anything like that. Go back and listen to my episode on the two-party system to find out more on that. But I'm happy to just let my vote stand where it stands. Now, I'm a conservative voter. A lot of times, most of the times, pretty much all of the times, it's going to stand with the conservative position, which is going to almost always be on the Republican side if it's there. Happy to vote Democrat if they want to support some of my conservative beliefs. If there's a Democrat candidate that supports my conservative views on taxes and abortion and government intervention and overreach and all that, great, fine. Happy to vote Democrat. I don't know why I just felt I needed to explain that to you, but I do. Here's why. Because today I'm not really talking to other conservatives. I'm not really talking to you folks out there. I'm not talking to my Republican listeners out there. Today I want to imagine that I'm talking to my Democrat listeners and my liberal listeners, and I want to imagine that I'm talking to myself 20 years ago. 20 years ago. I've been a conservative for maybe about like 15 years or whatever. But a lot of times when I'm making arguments, I like to imagine myself talking to myself. What is it that I would have needed to hear to at least budge my notions, my stereotypes? What is it that I would have liked to have heard a Republican or a conservative say when I was really dug in and entrenched in liberal ideology? There are a lot of folks out there, particularly a lot of black folks out there who say, I could never vote for a Republican because there's nothing in that party that appeals to me. They are the party of racism. They are the party of discrimination. They are racist. And since we do have this two-party system, which once again I am in support of, since we do have this two-party system that naturally drives black voters to the Democrat Party, the problem with that is we hardly have any capital in the Republican Party. So now we're just being totally taken advantage of by the Democrat Party, which is a big reason why I left and why I can't ever really think of myself as a Democrat voter, even though technically I am a registered Democrat in the state of California. That's, for this state, that is semantics. It's basically meaningless. All you need to know about my ideology, my dear liberal listeners, is that I am a conservative. I will vote how I feel conservatively, regardless of the parties. It just so happens that the parties are very polarized, and so my vote's typically going to be to one side. But the Democrat Party has been very successful in messaging to us, to our community, that Republicans are inherently and terribly racist, and the only alternative to them is the Democrat Party. And again, the problem with that is now we're in a position where we hardly have any capital in the Republican Party. So when Republicans come to power, we do get all panicked and freaked out. Oh my gosh, what do we do? I mean, we wouldn't think that way. We wouldn't feel worried if we knew we had some capital in that party, right? So on the one hand, there's been a lot that has happened from Democrats and from Republicans that have driven us out of the party. And then there's a lot of stuff that we have allowed to happen to prevent us from having a stake in that party and, you know, frankly, taking over that party if that's what we wish to do. So then the Democrats just get to take our votes for granted. So then they get to run this perpetual campaign of grievances, and they never solve our problems. You know, think about it, my dear liberal listener. If you're a faithful Democrat voter and you're Black, when is the last time that any Democrats solved anything for the community? And I don't mean this. I understand that these sound like Republican talking points, and I want to assure you that that is not my position here. That I'm not here to just spout these talking points. I'm genuinely asking, when is the last time that you looked around your community and said things are better because the Democrats are here and they're running things? That's what made me a conservative, right? I say that I tell this story all the time on the show about how I moved to Gary, Indiana, which is almost all Black. I had the privilege of running an after-school program that was sponsored by our church, and I was encouraged into that position by my father-in-law. And I discovered I was living and directly working with the policies that I had supported my whole life. And I discovered they didn't work. They weren't working. They weren't working the way that I was always told they would work. And I watched money pour into the community from the federal government, from the state government. The city always had some kind of money running through it, and it wasn't getting where it needed to go. It wasn't helping anybody. And years of voting. And I mean, you know, if I have to hear one more story about Richard Hatcher, I think he was one of the country's first Black mayors, and everybody in Gary loves Richard Hatcher because he was a Black mayor. Just because he was a Black mayor. Richard Hatcher ruined that city. In fact, before he died, my husband and I had personal dealings with Richard Hatcher, and he was as dishonest as they come. And he really tried to take advantage of us. We were trying to help the city. We were trying to do something good. And he recognized us as middle class. And then he thought, well, you know, I can get some personal kickback from these guys. We had to abandon what we were trying to do because Richard Hatcher, who was the lawyer on this project, got in the way. So I really have a problem with us saying, okay, well, we're just voting for this person because he's Black and because he's Democrat, and then not holding these people to account for the things they don't do, although they promise us. So I just want you to just try to hear me out today and know that I'm not coming from a place of wanting to make you a Republican voter, because heavens knows that's not on me. That's on them. And they don't do a very good job of it. And we can talk about that at a later time. And I discuss this we talk about this a lot on Red and Black. If you want to join our Red and Black show, you can find that on YouTube. Just look up Red and Black show on YouTube and it'll be on there. We talk about it a lot on the show, how all the ways the GOP fails to attract Black voters or to message to Black voters. Plenty of blame to go around. So here's what I want to make clear today before I get started. I am not recruiting you to the Republican Party. That is your business. That is not mine. And I do not work for the Republican Party. I get no kickbacks from the Republican Party. And the issues that they have are their issues. As I always say, I am not a conservative because of other conservatives. I am a conservative because I believe that there are certain principles that will be healthy for the Black community and ultimately for America at large, and they don't reside, to my mind, on the liberal side. That's why I'm a conservative. So my goal isn't to convince you to be a Republican today. My goal isn't to defend the Republican Party today. I want to be very clear about this because I can already hear some people trying to get me to both sides it. please know when you listen to this show, when you hear Kira Davis on this show, please know that every position I take has already been both sides. I've already done the both sides thing. I know that every argument I make to you includes the assumption that both sides are guilty of this, that, or the other to a certain extent on any issue. Okay, so we don't need to go there. Kira Davis knows how to both sides it. Today's argument, today's exploration is about this idea that Republicans are inherently racist. And the reason I'm making this argument today, and the reason I am speaking to you, my liberal listeners today, again, is not to get you to vote a certain way. And it's not even to get you to support certain policies. It's simply to help you feel better about half of this country. That's all. I just want to give you reasons to still disagree, still hold your ideology passionately, still be that person, but at least know that when your Republican mom or your son tells you that he's voting Republican and is grieving you, at least know that you have plenty of reasons to not be scared of that. That you have plenty of reasons to not automatically go into hysterics and cut that person out of your life. That there are reasonable arguments to be made for why these people might take these positions that don't have anything to do with racism. And you can at least look at them as someone you simply disagree with, even passionately. But they are not evil. It is my intention today to give you enough information, and at least enough to think about, that you might consider choosing not to look at the other side as completely evil. That's all. That's my only goal.
Politics are becoming more and more divisive every day. My name is Colin Jackson. I'm the co-host of Not Another Political Podcast, where we reject popular opinions and prioritize solutions over partisan dogma. Download Not Another Political Podcast on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast entertainment today.
So again, before we get started, I hope that I don't receive a lot of letters about how Republicans are the worst too. Yes, I know that they are the worst. I know. My argument isn't that, again, is not to defend Republicans. It's just to make you feel a little better about, maybe I can offer you a little less panic when your loved ones and family and people that you respect tell you that they're Republican. And then you go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm friends with this person. Ben Affleck said I would never work with somebody I knew was a Republican. He said that because he thinks that Republicans are inherently evil, not because he's really thought about what they believe or why they believe it. So I just want to give you a couple of examples and maybe help ease your mind, or at least give you some food for thought. So let's get started. I tried to write down not all of them because there's a lot, but some of the main points that those who view Republicans as inherently racist, that they would say often as proof of that. So number one, the thing that we're hearing a lot these days is voter suppression. Republicans support voter suppression. Republicans want to particularly suppress the black vote, and the evidence for that is voter ID laws. I find this one the strangest for a couple of reasons. The reason I do JLTY is to dig into these assumptions that we have, these talking points that we have, right? The whole idea that if you examine your talking points, sometimes you're not always saying what you think you are. And I think that the Democrat line on voter ID is a perfect example of that. I have never quite understood how this argument has gotten so far, because if you stop and just ponder it for like 2 seconds, it kind of falls apart. It doesn't seem like, at the very least, it doesn't seem like something you can pin on, well, Republicans just hate black people and don't want black people to vote. The truth is, black people vote overwhelmingly Democrat. So I can understand how a Democrat would look at any proposal that a Republican has to change the way we vote or to shore up voter laws or whatever, or prevent election fraud, I can see how any Democrat might look at Republicans and say, well, they're trying to make it so make it harder for black people to vote. But I think the whole voter ID thing is very strange to be upset about or to call racism. The only argument that I've ever heard on the voter ID issue is that because Black Americans are part of an underprivileged class, it's like a poll tax because you have to have an ID if you have to have an ID to vote, that means you have to go pay for your ID. And some older Americans who, like my aunt or my great-grandmother, who were born without birth certificates in a time when Black people weren't really recognized as part of this country, were making the whole affair harder for them. And so that equates to a poll tax. I just think it is, at this point in 2021, it is the most ridiculous argument. And it comes apart the second you examine it. I'm not going to go into the whole issue against voter ID, because I said I was going to explain to you why you at least don't have to assume that a Republican pushing for voter ID hates Black people. Because one of the most powerful tools you have as an American is your vote. It's probably the most powerful tool you have. Your vote alone is probably useless, but your vote in conjunction with 100 million other votes, that's power. And we know that Democrats believe this as well, because we get rock the vote every single voting cycle. We get celebrities out there talking about how important it is to go out and vote. We get Black celebrities going into our churches and into our events and saying, hey, Black folks, you have power. There is power in your vote. Let's unite. That's what they did in Georgia when people were saying, hey, Trump is ridiculous for suggesting that there's fraud. Let's get out there and prove that our votes are very powerful, and let's elect Warnock to the Senate. Let's win back the Senate. So there was a whole movement. The Black vote's already powerful. We know this because every election cycle, the Democrats talk about how powerful the Black vote is. And there's always a movement to get Black voters out there. So that being said, if something is very valuable, what do? Do you leave it exposed or do you protect it? If something is if your car is very valuable, you don't park your Lamborghini on the street and leave the keys in it and the doors unlocked. You don't leave the doors to your home unlocked. I have people who have sneaker collections, so they lock up their sneaker collections because those are important to those people. They're valuable. They carry value. The things that carry value to you, you protect. Your identity is valuable. That's why you have to show your ID to do certain things. That's why you have to show your ID to pick up tickets at the concert. But why? Because those tickets have value. You can't just be giving them away to everyone because you paid for them. So in order to make sure that you safely get the tickets that you deserve, you need to give someone your ID. It is the same concept with voter ID, which we've already established that all of us, particularly Democrats, believe that a vote is a powerful thing. So to assume that we wouldn't need an ID to protect that powerful thing, I think it flies in the face of the value of your vote. I think not requiring ID devalues the vote. And I think there are a lot of Republicans who take that position. In fact, that is the official position of the Republican Party. And it's also insulting to assume that because you're Black, you do not have the ability to get an ID. I don't know any Black people who have nothing. I don't. In the hood, in the suburbs, I've never met a Black person who had absolutely nothing, unless they were homeless. And even homeless people have phones. Thanks, Obama. I know plenty of Black people who live in poverty, but also have cable and also have nice shoes and also have brand name clothes. I know plenty of those people. Frankly, some of those people are middle class. I mean, I live in an area where people are wealthy by definition of how much money they bring in, but they are poor by definition of how much money they spend. And there are a lot of poor people living in the wealthy suburbs, folks. Let me tell you. So the idea that you are not able to, that asking someone to spend whatever your license fee is in your state, 25, 40, 50 bucks. That asking somebody to spend that amount for an ID that protects their vote is equal to a poll tax, I think is ridiculous, particularly when we require ID for almost everything else. So the argument might be there if no one else had to require ID for anything, right? And then it was just for voting. Yeah, that's a fair argument, but that's not how it goes, is it? My Aunt Eartha was born without a birth certificate. This is, she's quite elderly right now, and living in Gary, Indiana, lovely woman, and raised children and grandchildren and got a nursing degree and has served her community and her family with her whole heart. And she has an ID. She has an ID because she likes to do things like get a job and cash her checks. And when she was of a certain age, go to the bar and maybe have a good time. I do recall a story about her and her husband, Bill, Uncle Bill, and mom and dad going to Lucky's Club on 11th Avenue in Gary, Indiana. And I think Bill was hiding a bottle of booze under his jacket to get into the club, and then he dropped it in the middle of the club. Oh, boy. My mother-in-law talks about how embarrassing that was. I would be so embarrassed, too. But so back in the day, my aunt and uncle and my mother and father-in-law, yeah, they had to show ID to drink some booze, to have some fun. So if you want to do these things, if you want to participate in life in any way, you need an ID for a library card. So I just think the argument is it can fall apart. Now, if you have your position on voter ID that you really think it's wrong and that there are other ways to protect your vote, fine. This isn't actually, even though I just made, I think, a very compelling argument for why voter ID should be just fine and isn't a big deal, that's fine. Again, I'm not trying to convince you to change your mind on this issue. I'm trying to say that this is how Republicans view the issue. So they're not saying we wish fewer black people would vote. What they're saying is this is a very valuable thing, your vote. So why wouldn't we protect it so we can make sure that there's no cheating? And if Democrats aren't worried about cheating, then this should not be an issue. So I think you can feel at least at ease about your Republican friends and family who say, hey, no, I support voter ID laws. I support what's going on in Georgia. And by the way, next week I'm going to talk about I'm going to break down the Georgia voter law for you. And we will expand some of these topics that I'm talking about right now when it comes to voter ID. So I'm not leaving you in the lurch. I've got a lot to say about it. And there's some good arguments on either side. So we're going to explore that, and I'm going to actually go line by line, kind of. It's a long bill, but line by line in the Georgia voter bill so we can all see what's in it together. And maybe it'll ease some of your minds, and maybe it'll make some of you angrier. I don't know. Tune in next week. So I just want to give you assurance that if your Republican friend supports voter ID, it's probably not because they hate black people. It's probably because they think that your vote, especially as a black American, is very valuable and should be protected from being used by anybody else in any other capacity. And maybe the solution to the problem of the 0.0000003% of black American citizens who don't have an ID, maybe the solution is to take some of this money that you're putting into fighting voter ID and putting it into getting those people their IDs, helping them with that. Republicans support capitalism, and capitalism is racist. This is a tough one to talk about without going into the whole argument about socialism versus capitalism and what capitalism really is and how it works. All I can say is capitalism has been the most successful form of economic governance, if you will, in the history of mankind. And it's not an accident that the United States is currently the world's most influential superpower. Capitalism plays a big part in that. I think a lot of people are suspicious of capitalism simply more than anything because they just identify with socialism, and so they don't like capitalism. But the argument for why capitalism is racist really is rooted in slavery and how that was an arm of capitalism. It was used for capitalistic pursuits, right? We would call that these days crony capitalism, which is using the government to benefit your entity above everybody else's. We would call that crony capitalism, which is bad, which is just as bad as socialism. But capitalism itself, that's an economic system. It's not rooted in racism because many Black and brown societies use capitalism. Capitalism is the idea of supply and demand, consumers and providers, and people making those exchanges freely with each other. Now, who gets to make those exchanges in this country and how hard it's been for certain racial groups, that's a different story. But the apparatus of capitalism is not inherently racist. How the government might wield it or use it may be, and that's probably an argument that goes into institutional racism, which we might talk about. Well, actually, I have talked about it on this show, and you can go back and hear my episode on institutional racism. But capitalism is usually something that's used to point to Republicans being racist, that there is some kind of inherent equality in socialism that Black people need to embrace. I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I think socialism creates vast inequality, and it is finite and extremely detrimental to the Black community. And we can just look into our own community to see that capitalism has actually been the most beneficial for our community. We just need to look to hip hop. A lot of people asked why so many hip hop artists would support Trump in the last election. And I mean, obviously not all of them, but like more than we've ever seen, right? It was just weird to see Trump showing up in pictures and magazines with Lil Wayne and I mean, oh, God forbid, Kanye West and all these other people. At the very least, there are a lot of hip hop artists who were saying, I don't like the guy, but I don't hate the guy. And a lot of people were confused by that. Well, you know what? Hip hop artists are capitalists. And these are guys who they come from a sector of employment that is very much merit-based in a lot of ways. So you're hustling to get to the top for a lot of years. You get to the top, you finally get that record contract, and then you see the chunk of taxes that come out of your paycheck. So you lived in abject poverty for 20 years, 30 years, like abject poverty for 30 years. You get your first paycheck, it's let's say $5 million, and the government takes $2.5 million. Yeah, that's going to sting. And there's a lot of people that be like, well, you can live on $2.5 million. That's not the point. Where is that $2.5 million going to benefit anybody when this guy already grew up in abject poverty, being promised the world by Democrats his whole life? Oh, we're going to solve this if you just, this one vote, this one last election, this one last tax package. So now he's left wondering, well, I was one of those people that needed all this money all my life and I didn't get it. And now that I have earned it myself, the government wants to take it from me and to do what with it? More of nothing? Yeah, they get suspicious, right? Also, they see how much of their effort is being taken by a record company that isn't necessarily giving them a good return for their money or a fair return for their money, which would be capitalism, which would be true capitalism. So yeah, these guys are driven into capitalism because they're hustlers, they're earners. They know the value of the effort that they have put in. And they see that when they can do it on their own, the more of their own money that they can keep, the more of their own community that they can help. They can do things, they can support their families. A lot of these guys have their own foundations, their own charitable foundations. Some of them choose to stand on top of cars and throw money up in the air in the middle of the street. But these guys it's not just all a selfish endeavor. This money does go back into their communities in many different ways. Not to mention the inspiration that they provide. So that's capitalism. We've seen capitalism work for Black Americans. It's when the government comes in to thwart capitalism or to make it harder to be capitalistic that we suffer. We always suffer first. The Black community always suffers first. Here's a great example. Occupational licensing. I talk about this all the time. Occupational licensing. That's when you need a license to do something that you're already doing, like braiding hair. This is a big one. What do you need a license for to braid hair? Every black mother I know has been braiding hair for her daughter. If she's got a daughter or a niece, has been braiding hair since she learned how to braid hair as a kid. Every black woman does it to a certain extent. Now, some are better than others, me not included, but there are many black women who their side gig is braiding hair. Everybody in the hood has somebody who needs it. You get good enough at it. Hey, you send somebody's sister comes over to your house, sits and watches movies with you for an afternoon. You give them $100 and they braid your hair. Why does the government need that? That arrangement has been working for black women forever. Why does the government need to get involved in that? Why does the government have any business in you making a mutual agreement with your neighbor about doing her hair? When you don't need any training, you already know how to do it. You already know how to be safe because guess what? People who do hair don't want to be sick. And people who do hair don't want to get their clients sick because that's how you keep getting clients in. So they already know how to keep their area safe. But even if they don't, it's still an agreement between the two neighbors. One neighbor saying, well, okay, you keep your instruments a little dirty, but you know what? I'm going to overlook that because I just want to get my hair braided right now and you've got a space. It's an agreement between two people. Why the hell does this black woman need a license from the government to tell her how to braid hair when black folks been braiding hair forever? That's not capitalism. That's squashing capitalism. Now you're coming in and you're shutting down the labor of black women, which has happened. There's a famous case in New Jersey, which might still be in the court system, to be honest. It's many years old. But in a couple of instances, the state has come to actually shut down these women in their own homes. You know, women who aren't doing anything wrong, but just engaging in a capitalistic endeavor. And the state says, oh, no, sorry, you need to pay $1,200 for this occupational license, for this piece of paper that says you're allowed to do what you've already been doing. Do you see? Capitalism is what that black woman is doing, braiding hair. And socialism is what the state is doing, coming in and saying, you're not allowed to braid hair unless we give you permission. Capitalism works. And black people are capitalistic. I don't know any black person who doesn't have a couple of side hustles. It's ingrained in our nature. And I know that there is a stereotype of the welfare queen. And trust me, those people do exist. But even a lot of the folks on welfare are hustling in some way. They're just not telling the government because they want to keep getting that free money, and then they can go out and hustle and make the extra money on their own. A lot of people on welfare have a side hustle, folks. That is the God's honest truth, which is why we're going to talk about welfare in a minute. I won't go there. Anyways, again, not trying to convince you to change your point of view on capitalism or how it works, but trying to say that this is how the other side thinks. So the other side isn't saying capitalism is going to squash black people. What they're saying is capitalism might actually be the best way for black people to elevate themselves in their communities. And so let's make it easier for them to participate in capitalism. And that means, pulling back on some government programs and letting people participate in the free markets freely without the boot of government on their neck. So once again, that's a point that maybe you can look at your Republican friend who is pro-capitalism, and you don't necessarily have to say, you're evil, you hate black people. You might not agree with their position, but maybe there's a way that you can see that they see their position as helpful and not deliberately harmful.
Politics are becoming more and more divisive every day. My name is Colin Jackson. I'm the co-host of Not Another Political Podcast, where we reject popular opinions and prioritize solutions over partisan dogma. Download Not Another Political Podcast on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast entertainment today.
Republicans oppose welfare. That makes them racist. I got all kinds of problems with this point. Because my left-wing friends and some of my conservative friends will tell you that Republicans are racist because every time they talk about welfare, they're talking about black people. And that Republicans want to end welfare or reform welfare or make it harder to get because they look at Black people as lazy and unresponsive. And to me, that argument is racist, right? Because you're making the same assumptions that you think the Republicans are making, that all Black people are on welfare, that all people on welfare are Black. So even to just engage in that argument, you're becoming a part of the problem. So all right there is a logical fallacy. However, let's just assume this point. Let's just concede that a lot of people on welfare are minorities, just for the sake of there. Statistically wise, there are more white people on welfare, but there are also more white people in this country. So per capita, that might be a little different. I haven't looked it up. Anyways, my point is this. Welfare is not inherently racist, or to talk about it is not inherently racist, because you've got to make all kinds of assumptions about welfare and who gets it in order to have this conversation about race in the first place. So I think both sides are best to step away from that because it can get ugly. There's a lot of proof that welfare is detrimental to our communities. It actually hasn't helped us. And the more money we pour in, the less we receive. I would harken back to the argument I made at the top of this episode about voting reflexively Democrat as Black people, and yet nothing's changed. So what do you say to the guy who grew up in the hood and now comes back at 50 and nothing's different? My husband and I went back to Gary, Indiana in February, and I was shocked to see that it was worse than when we left 12 years ago. And it's certainly worse than when he was growing up. He grew up there his whole life, and it's certainly worse. It never got better. In fact, it started out okay. And then it never got better. It only went downhill. And yet every election cycle in Gary, people are subjected to the typical talking points of white flight did this to us. This is white people's problem. If we only have more money, if the white folks in government would just give us more money, if we would just elect this Black mayor, and yet nothing changes. Gary, Indiana is about 35%. 35% of the people live below the poverty line, about there, and 1.8% of those people receive food stamps, which is always that's an indicator that we use for welfare. It's a generalization because there's all different kinds of welfare, but that's statistically speaking, when we talk about these things, we're usually using food stamp recipients as an indicator for welfare. And so that's 1.8%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually the highest in the state. And it's only rivaled by South Bend. That's it. So we're looking around our communities and we're seeing nothing's changed. How all these years, all these politicians come in, they say, vote for us, give us more money. We need more money in these welfare programs. If welfare is a help, then why hasn't it helped? Why hasn't it changed? Maybe welfare has some detriments to it. Maybe the idea that welfare suppresses the need to work, or at least work within the system, right? Because I just said a lot of folks have side hustles. I know most of the people I know on welfare have a side hustle. They're not ignorant and they're not lazy, but they're taking the money that's offered to them, and then you don't want to go on the rolls because you'll lose that. Sometimes it's a double-edged sword, you guys. Sometimes it's not about being lazy or being deceptive. Sometimes the sword is double-edged and there's just no way to get out of this without getting cut. You're going to lose your benefits if you go get a real job that goes on the tax rolls. You're going to lose those benefits, and you're going to lose them before you're able to get on your own feet. But at the same time, welfare is not enough to springboard you to anything. You need to be having other income. The situation is a lot more complicated and nuanced than people think, and it's not just about people being lazy, even though there are plenty of lazy people on welfare for 100% sure. But there's a lot of just hustlers on welfare who just are kind of trapped in the system and they don't know what else to do. So they're just going to be like, okay, I'm going to take advantage of this as long as possible. So the point is that welfare isn't working, not in the way that we said it should be working. And the proof is in the pudding. So how long do you do the same thing before you say this isn't working? How much more money do you pour into something before you say this isn't working? When we first moved to Southern California, we were still living high on our middle-class Midwestern life. Of course, we got knocked off that high horse real quick by the cost of living change. But we came here with a Land Rover. I loved my Land Rover. It was an old school Land Rover. I love that thing. But it broke down as soon as we got here. And European cars are expensive to fix. We had paid off the car. It was totally ours. But now to be hit with like a $2,000 bill, $4,000 bill, another $2,000. At one point, we had to decide, nothing's getting better. Is it worth pouring more money into this? Do I love my Land Rover? Yes. Am I heartbroken to lose it? Yes. Does it make sense to give the mechanic another $5,000 to fix something that may or may not be fixable through no fault of his own? No, that makes no more sense. It makes no sense. We've got to sell what's left of this car and downgrade to a Kia, which, by the way, still have that Kia 12 years later. My son drives it. Amazing car. I think it's been in the shop once. Besides maintenance, that car is great. I'm not getting paid by Kia, by the way. The Kia has held up. It's got over 100,000 miles on it. It's a Sportage. We love it. It's done our family fantastic. Highly recommended if you're looking for a vehicle. All right, sidebar. Next time I'll ask Kia to pay me. That's a sidebar. But at some point, right, don't you look at the proof? You have to say, now some of you might be out there saying, well, no, we just need a little more. We just need a little more money, or these programs aren't structured correctly or whatever. Okay, fair enough argument. Again, I'm not trying to convince you to flip your argument or change your argument, but maybe you can see that there's another side of that argument that doesn't involve racism, but actually involves the opposite. It involves saying, hey, the way the system's set up isn't helpful. It's not working. We're looking at proof. We're looking at numbers. We're looking at decades of statistics. And even the proof comes every election cycle when our politicians come around to us and tell us things are worse than ever. So clearly none of this has been working. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you can find examples of that all over. So a Republican might not be saying, hey, we hate black people. Let's get rid of welfare. Maybe what they're saying is welfare doesn't seem to be working. Maybe there's a better way. Again, that doesn't have to be your position, but it might make you feel better about your neighbor or your family member who is a Republican and says they would like to restrict some of the welfare offerings. I mean, look at this, folks. We give $500 billion a year for children, for welfare for children across the country. $500 billion a year. That's a lot of money. So we're not skimping. $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year this country spends on welfare. $1 trillion a year on welfare. So we're not slacking. It could be that the system just doesn't work and was never designed to work, not the way we hoped it would. So again, just another way that you can look at your friend or family member and at the very least say, okay, I don't agree with them, but their position probably has nothing to do with hate. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. Sometimes that comes up. I don't hear that argument that much these days because I think there are more intellectuals who have come to the consensus that the Civil Rights Act, for all its good intentions, was a bit problematic. And Johnson was a bit problematic himself. But the Civil Rights Act, I think because we get carried away with titles and politicians know this, so they put these really fancy titles on things that make it sound really good, and then you vote on it. But if you read it, you're like, oh, this isn't about that at all. Here in California, we have something called the Safe and Healthy Schools Act. Safe and Healthy Schools Act. Yeah, I think that's the name of it. All right, listening to that title, what would you think it is? Maybe new health COVID regulations for schools, or maybe even sex ed. Maybe it's related to that. Maybe it's changing the health curriculum or the sex ed curriculum in some way. Maybe it is metal detectors or increasing police presence or dealing with discipline of students in some way. No, it has nothing to do with any of that. It has to do with reducing the sentences for parolees and for violent criminals, which is a big issue we're going through in this state. I mean, you wouldn't know because they have nothing to do with each other. Okay, here it is. I found it. It was Prop 47, the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act. The Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act. Prop 47 implemented 3 broad changes to felony sentencing law. This is the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act. Prop 47 implemented 3 broad changes to felony sentencing laws. First, it reclassified certain theft and drug possession offenses from felonies to misdemeanors. You can go back and listen to my episode on California's homeless problem for more information on Prop 47 and the devastating impacts it's had. Second, it authorizes defendants currently serving sentences for felony offenses that would have qualified as misdemeanors under the proposition to petition courts for resentencing under the new misdemeanor provisions. And third, it authorizes defendants who have completed their sentences for felony convictions that would have qualified as misdemeanors under the proposition to apply to reclassify those convictions to misdemeanors. That's the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act, folks. You can look it up on courts.ca.gov. Yeah. So just because something has a nice name doesn't mean that what's in it is nice. And in fact, most of the time it's not. Most of the time the name is not reflective of what's in it. And they know you're just going to vote on the name. They know most of you are never going to read the bills. So this is another thing I like to tell my liberal friends. If you see a news headline that Republicans have rejected this equal rights bill or this bill that would help mothers or minorities, aren't they awful when you see that and you just cannot believe that Republicans are so awful that they would reject this? Or like the stimulus bill, that they're so awful that they would reject it? I would encourage you to read the bill, not the headline, but go in and read the bill. And maybe you still don't agree with Republicans rejecting it, but you might see that in the bill are these little Trojan horses or these little things that get put in there that don't belong in there, or these little policy projects that have no place being in there. And the Republicans are voting against those things, not against the concepts that you think are enveloped. Republicans voting against the Safe Schools and Neighborhoods Act in California were not voting against safer schools and safer neighborhoods. They were voting against putting convicted felons out into the street before they've served their time. The Civil Rights Act has a really nice name and it did some good things. But the problem that a lot of Republicans have had traditionally with the Civil Rights Act is that it created a protected class. And then the only way to gauge if we're protecting that class was to create racial quotas, and also it made the federal government the judge of thoughts, the thought police, because when you are suing somebody with the Civil Rights Act or using the Civil Rights Act to sue somebody, a judge necessarily has to decide what is in the accused person's mind when they hired this person or didn't hire that person, or the government's got to be the person who decides what that person was thinking. So there might be all kinds of reasons why you support the Civil Rights Act. And of course, it sounds good because it's called the Civil Rights Act. And it's the same with the Equal Rights Act as well, that the Democrats are always bringing up about equal rights for women. And so there might be all kinds of reasons why you support it, and that's fine. But there's also, you don't have to assume that somebody who opposes it is necessarily racist. They may actually feel that it will perpetuate racism. There's an argument to be made for that. So it's not 100% sure that, hey, Republicans just hate civil rights and they want to get rid of civil rights. No, there are some very big problems with the bill, even though we kind of accept it as a part of legislation now. But there are very big problems that still persist to this day. So you can actually be intellectually honest and kind while still opposing the Civil Rights Act or the Equal Rights Act as it stands. So there's a way to see both sides of this argument. You don't have to assume that someone's evil because they say, well, I have problems with this. Really, what we should always be doing, and this is a little argument of my own, is just thinking of these things as restoring constitutional rights. So I've never believed that slaves, African Americans, women, anybody has been denied. I don't believe anybody has been cut out of the Constitution. I believe that we have had our constitutional rights denied. And so every bit of progress that we've made is about restoring our constitutional rights. We were born with these constitutional rights. We were given these constitutional rights because it's right there in the Constitution. All men are created equal. It's right there. It didn't say all white men or all black men or all men from Africa. It said all. And of course, we know the word men to historically mean mankind. But it says right there. So clearly, if all men are not being treated equally, then that's a violation of the Constitution. You don't necessarily need something to shore it up. You need people who will be willing to help restore the constitutional rights of people. That being said, again, I don't make this argument to decide for you where you stand on the Civil Rights Act or the Equal Rights Act. I just want to say that there is a way to actually be skeptical of these things that doesn't include racism.
Politics are becoming more and more divisive every day. My name is Colin Jackson. I'm the co-host of Not Another Political Podcast, where we reject popular opinions and prioritize solutions over partisan dogma. Download Not Another Political Podcast on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast entertainment today.
I'm running out of time here, and I darn well know it. Sorry. Trump is a racist. So we can't end this without Trump. Trump's a racist. Charlottesville, the wall, maybe even school choice. I'm not going to relitigate school choice. Go back and listen to my school choice episode where I make an extremely convincing case for school choice as the black choice. I mean, I am proud of my persuasive skills on that one. Go check it out. But there are many black people. In fact, studies show that the majority of black people are in favor of school choice once they know what it is. Sometimes unions paint it as something different, but what it is, should you not be able to choose where your kid goes to school? You know, if I live in Gary, Indiana, where half the schools have lost their accreditation and they're graduating black males at 50%, and they have drug problems and gang problems in the schools and no air conditioning and hardly have any books. I mean, I can push for all the money I want, but what does my kid do while they wait for this magical amount of money to come in, with whatever amount that's going to be, that's going to solve all the problems? Whose child has to be that guinea pig? Not mine. I should have the choice to put my kids somewhere else until y'all get it figured out. There's no black person that lives in the inner city who doesn't like that deal. Every black parent has wished that there was a place to send their kid who lives in these areas, that they could easily send their kid to the nice schools that all the white folks' kids go to. Why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they be allowed to do that? So that's a choice issue. That's a argument you can make that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with racism, or it does have to do with racism. Actually, if you're telling black parents you got to just settle for what you got and be grateful for it, I guess that is kind of racist. I never quite understood the fury against Trump over racism. Like, everybody loved Donald Trump until he put an R behind his name and decided to run for office. I don't know any black person who worked with him or was on his shows or worked with him in movies who I never once heard anybody call him a racist, a womanizer, a jerk, gross, and a wealthy elitist or whatever. Heard all kind of bad orange man, heard all kinds of insults over the years towards a guy like Donald Trump. But racism never really came into the picture until he ran for office. And then the best I can suss out is that it's based on a couple of things. Well, one is just the assumption that Republicans are racist automatically, which is what I'm working against today, or trying to get you to look at this a different way today. The other is because he wanted to build the wall. And I guess because he wants to build it on the southern border, and those coming across the border happen to be Mexican, that makes the idea racist. And yet we are in the middle of a border crisis right now where we're 172,000 kids right now with nowhere to go in this country because they're alone. Their parents have sent them over the border alone with dangerous criminals that we call coyotes. They're human smugglers. And we've created this crisis through just open borders. We've created a human trafficking crisis through open borders. Now, you may be in favor of open borders. Again, not trying to disabuse you of your notions. What I'm saying is Maybe people who are in favor of a wall aren't in favor of the wall because they hate Mexicans. They're in favor of a wall because they see that open borders, or they feel that open borders exploits vulnerable people, encourages human trafficking, and it makes it more difficult for us to track people within the boundaries of our country so they can avail themselves, or we can help them avail themselves of the laws of this country. So a lot of people are streaming into this country. They haven't come in here legally, so they have no legal protections, and they sort of live on the fringes of society. We cannot welcome them properly into American society. We can't help their communities when it comes to law enforcement, or when it comes to getting rid of dangerous criminals in their neighborhoods, because we don't know who they are and the law doesn't necessarily apply to them. They don't they work in this country and they contribute to this country, but they don't get to vote. That doesn't seem fair. Like, these are all things that can be solved through legal immigration. And so a wall on a border that is wide open and that has been exploited for decades by drug cartels and human traffickers. I mean, if the wall has a door in it, is it bad? Is it so bad? Again, you may think that, no, a wall is a bad idea, but that doesn't necessarily make it a racist idea. There's arguments to be made for a wall. I mean, you got walls, right? I don't think that there are a lot of Democrats who will scoff at that argument. Do you have walls in your home? Do you lock your door? A wall in your home is not the same thing as a wall on the border. Well, no, I do think that that's an apt metaphor. Just because you don't like it, because it doesn't serve your purposes, doesn't mean that it's not an apt metaphor. It most certainly is. I challenge you to live with no walls in your home. And then there's the Charlottesville thing, the both sides comment that will haunt Donald Trump for the rest of his life. But I've talked about it on this show before. I deeply, deeply encourage you to go back and listen to the entire audio. Don't read the headline. Don't just take that 2-second clip that got clipped and then sent out as a soundbite. But listen to the whole audio. And I can't make you do it. I can only encourage you to do it. It's easy to find. Listen to the entire audio. That's not what he said. So the idea was that he was defending groups, so weird. It's so crazy to look at these guys and be scared, like pretend that we're scared of them. These white supremacy groups, these guys with tiki torches and Hawaiian shirts or whatever. That's not what he was saying. What was going on in Charlottesville that day was a battle about these Confederate statues. And there were protesters out during the day. Protesters on both sides, right? Protesters for keeping them up, protesters for taking them down. It was tense but respectful. They were just competing protests. And at night, the weirdos came out, which is always how it is in activism. It's the same way with Antifa. I've talked to you about my experience with Occupy Wall Street, how there is the genuine, engaged protesters during the day who are just hippies and, they're just there for the cause. But at night, that's when the corporate-sponsored protesters would come out. And those people had money and lawyers and an agenda. It was the same thing in Charlottesville. It was just normal people in the day. At night, the weirdos came out and caused havoc and caused trouble. And you can hear Trump specifically say, I just remembered I keep this quote on my phone because it comes up so many times. So here's the full quote. He says, "Excuse me, they didn't put themselves down as neo-Nazis, and you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and white nationalists because they should be condemned totally. Racism is evil, and to those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans." He was answering a question about the daytime protests. He said, you cannot include these neo-Nazis in that group. There were bad people that showed up, but it was these just regular Americans protesting. And then these jerks showed up at night. And by the way, I totally condemn them. That's why it's always a joke when it was always a big joke towards the end of Trump's presidency. It was like, why doesn't he condemn white supremacy? It's like he always does, but they never run it. I mean, even in the debates, he's just like, God, okay, fine. Yes. Like, duh. This is a duh. You can go find the audio for yourself. The both sides comment was aimed at people who disagree about the statues, not about, hey, there's good people in the neo-Nazi group and then there's good people who aren't neo-Nazis. That soundbite got torn up. So that's the only other piece of proof that I could offer. Again, you may say to yourself, well, I think I know what he meant. And I still think that he's given whatever shelter to these points of view. Okay, fine. Again, it's not my goal to disabuse you of your notions on this. It is my goal to help you see that perhaps there is a way where other people looked at what Trump said and still could support Trump without being a racist. Because maybe they looked at what he said and they made the realization that I did as I was watching it, which is he wasn't saying Nazis are good people. And we know that because directly following that statement, he said, I condemn neo-Nazis and white supremacists and all the people that you're supposed to condemn. So again, you may think he was lying. You may not agree with him. And that's fair. You do you. I'm just saying that maybe there's a way to look at people who support him. And you can say, instead of saying, you must be a horrible person because look at what he said in Charlottesville, you can at least say, well, maybe that person sees it differently than I do. So they're not necessarily racist. Maybe they're just a moron, which is fine. That's a step forward as long as you're not thinking of people as totally evil. My whole point with today's episode is to give you permission to look at the other side as perhaps just the other side rather than total racist. And again, you might disagree with how the issues are being framed, with how the issues are being talked about. You might disagree with the thinking or the strategy of Republicans. You might even disagree that some of this stuff isn't based in race, but maybe just knowing that there are at least logical arguments for the veracity of some of these things on the other side, at least maybe you can look at the people on the other side that you've been claiming are evil and just say, well, maybe they're just wrong. That's all I want. For you to be able to say, maybe they're just wrong. Because the other thing, in order to go with this narrative that our media and our politicians keep throwing at us every day, which is America has never been more racist, America has never been more divided. In order to go with that narrative, you have to sincerely believe that 50% of your country are abject, horrible racists. And that can't possibly be true. Statistically speaking, logically speaking, reasonably speaking, there are all kinds of people in your life who are Republicans who are not racist. Like I say, you may think they're wrong, but they're not racist. They're not. And you may be saying to yourself, I don't know how they can vote Republican. They're so nice. They're so intelligent. They're so kind. They're such good neighbors. How can they? You may be saying to yourself that. I've tried to answer those questions for you today. Again, not to change your vote, but to ease your mind. And I think it's very unfair, in fact, illogical to look at the Republicans in your life that you like or love and say, well, they're the exception. You're really insulting them. You're saying that they're too stupid to know that the people that they support are racist. It could just be that they have a different way of looking at it. And it has nothing to do with race or hating certain people because of how they look. I'm just throwing the possibility out there. I'm just hoping, sometimes against hope, that there are still some reasonable people out there who are willing to be curious, who are willing to explore the logic of both sides, and at least willing to say, I don't agree, but I don't think you're evil. That's my hope. I feel like those people are becoming few and far between. And I do believe it's a problem of media. I do. You're just bombarded with this messaging. We're reading a great book in our book club called Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann. And it was written in 1922. And it's all about how we form our public opinions. And a lot of it, almost all of it, has to do with what information the media and the government decides to give us. And then we fill in the rest. We're going to be holding a book club Zoom pretty soon here. I've got to schedule it. I haven't scheduled it as of this recording, but I'll probably lock that down today because we're ready to go and talk about it. So join me over at davisnation.locals.com and get in on that book club discussion. davisnation.locals.com. It's for subscribers only, so you have to be a subscriber, but it's a low amount. It's nothing crazy. And you get some other stuff like bonus JLTYs and great safe discussion with people in the chat room who are not going to make you feel like an idiot because you have a differing opinion. You might get challenged, but no one is going to personally insult you. And we just have good times over there too. So I hope that I've given people some reason to feel a little bit better, and I hope that this episode encourages those of you who are on the other side from me ideologically, but long to have a logical discussion. I hope this encourages you to go out there and have those and not be afraid to have those and not think that you're encouraging racism or encouraging evil because of it. I'm hoping I'm giving you reasons to look at your fellow citizen as simply that, just the other half of the country. All right, well, if you have an opinion on today's episode or any other episode, you can write me at JLTY@protonmail.com, JLTY@protonmail.com. Let me know what your opinions are here, or if you have some comments on our mini-sodes. I got a lot of great comments on the slogans mini-sode. Apparently, I'm not the only one who is annoyed by a lot of these slogans. I'm going to read some of those responses next week, and my episode with my father-in-law should be out as well. So let me know what you think of that. If you have some questions for the pastor, you want to drop them, you're going to get about 3 more of these, 2 or 3 more. So if you have some questions that you'd like to ask him personally, you can send those along to JLTY@protonmail.com, and I'll save them for the next time that we're chatting. And he's really great at answering questions. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow me over on Twitter at Real Kira Davis. Hit up my YouTube page at JLTY. I'm on Instagram. I'm on all your social media spots. But mostly, if you want to talk to me more, chat with me more, meet more like-minded people, join us over at davisnation.locals.com. It is a subscription service, but it's safe. There's no censorship over there. We don't have to worry about videos getting taken down or weird messages from the powers that be that are lurking in your private chat rooms telling you that this content is inappropriate or contains misinformation. You're not going to get any of that over there. So join us over there and bring your opinions with you. Hey, listen, until we talk again, don't forget, every now and then, just stop and listen to yourself. Talk to you next time.
The FCB Radio Network. First class broadcasting worldwide.